Hey, welcome everybody to this exciting session tonight. We're really excited about our time together with Dr. Greg Carey. Tonight, our conversation is about Christian nationalism, particularly how to lead, pastor and lead in a Christian nationalism context. So we're going to hear from Greg Carey. Greg is a a professor of New Testament at Lancaster Theological Seminary and Moravian Theological Seminary. I've got to think of him as a friend, even though we've never actually been in the same place since we've met. It's always virtual like this, which this is the new world we live in. But I'm really looking forward to Greg. He comes highly recommended, and I'm so thankful that he's been gracious enough to spend this time with us. So, Greg, I'm just going to turn it over to you, and we're so glad you're with us, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Bill. I also would share that um, I missed when I should have done this and y'all were all there because I made just a calendar mess. And so I'm sorry and grateful to see all of you and grateful for Bill's hospitality. Um, I do a lot of talks about Christian nationalism, dozens actually, and but it's not my primary thing. I'm a New Testament scholar. In this slide, you'll see a QR code. That's a bibliography if you choose to use it. Give you a minute to think about it. But for a little bit, I'll mostly talk at you, and then we'll have time to talk together. I found that that works best for the kind of content that we're working with. And that's not usually how I teach. If you're someone who doesn't like being talked at, I don't either. I just find that this works for this material. One of the things that struck me really over 10 years, especially here in the US, is how things have changed for faith leaders. Like, I graduated from seminary in 1992, and we knew there were hot issues, but we also thought that as long as you just address them as issues and you didn't do it at the level of political figures or, certainly not parties, you could do that most of the time unless it was especially hot. And I would say around 2014, 2015, I started hearing pastors say, I don't know what to do. No matter what I say, somebody's mad about it. And especially it feels, this is my interpretation of what I said, it feels like a loyalty test. And one of the factors in that really was the emergence of Christian nationalism as the way I would put it is Christian nationalist attitudes have been, at least in American churches, for a long time. But their access to power and amplification and their openness to naming a willingness not just for Christians to be influential, but for Christians to have dominion in society has really accelerated to the degree that I would say, even still, the spiritual leaders I work with are still surprised, even though they've been in the hot water for a while. So I'd like to start by thinking about what we're up against, which is a way of just sort of explaining what the phenomenon is. This will be brief, but it's important. Theoretically, Christian nationalism is easy to describe. Christian nationalists are people who think that they want their nation to be a Christian nation, to say it is, to run itself by Christian principles. In the US, that goes with sort of a founding story that the country was founded to be a Christian nation, which isn't exactly what most historians would say, but that's widespread. And a belief that, again, this is a United States context, that there's a special relationship between God and the United States, that God caused the country to come up and also blesses it when it does what's right. If it doesn't do what's right, it's looking for trouble. The Public Religion Research Institute uses a series of questions to measure how many people align with a Christian nationalist outlook. And these are the kind of survey questions that are, do you agree, strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree, that the government should declare it a Christian nation, that laws should be based on Christian values, that if we move away from those Christian foundations, there's that story of the founding, right? We won't have a country anymore. That being Christian's an important part of being American. The last one, that God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of society. That one is stunning to me because I didn't hear that language much at all until about 12 years ago. My background is Southern Baptist. I'm used to conservative Christianity. I'm comfortable with conservative Christians, not adversarial. Um, but that language of dominion has a specific history, and it has become, rather than sort of on the fringes, it's become a central part of what's happening in the United States. When they measure the results of these surveys, this is fairly recent reporting, about a third of Americans are sympathetic to that outlook, but about two-thirds aren't. And it raises the question of, when Christian dominionists or Christian nationalists say they want a Christian country, which Christians do they mean? Right? Do they mean United Methodists? Because their social statements sure don't align with those policies. Do they mean Black Christians? Again, Black Christians have radically different social views on many important issues than white Christians do, who share their theology almost top to bottom, right? We could go on with different groups of Christians and our different attitudes towards social and political issues. But when you frame Christian nationalism in this way, you can see that it really is aligned more around power than it is around a particular religious doctrine, power and a particular political agenda. So the next slide I'm going to show, usually when I'm doing presentations for groups who haven't had a conversation, I spend a lot of time on this slide. But I think I won't have to. You'll remember this moment. It's June 2021. There are the Black Lives Matter protests all over the country. There's been property damage in Washington. You see St. John's Episcopal Church is boarded up. Donald Trump was president then. He wanted to suppress the protests in Washington, made a speech in the Rose Garden about the protests, but then had security forces clear a path for him and other high-level officials to walk to St. John's Church, very nearby. He didn't speak there, he just held up a Bible. And I think this image is perfect because it shows the backing of a particular kind of political authority with Christian symbols, right? There's a church, a Bible, and I say they're being used as props because that's not Donald Trump's Bible. He didn't have his own Bible in the White House. They tried out different Bibles to see which would be good for a photo op, and I approved that choice. And the church, no one consulted the church. The next day, reporters asked the Bishop of Washington, who said, this is counter to the values of our church. We certainly never would have blessed that happening. But something's happening here in the politics of the United States, right? There's racial unrest. And to buttress a particular kind of political authority, I would say white political authority, Donald Trump uses these symbols just for the photo op, for the power of a photo op. I think that leads to, one way of defining Christian nationalism is, what do Christian nationalists believe about Christianity in the nation? But another is to say, look, this is Christian language and symbols, but they're being used to buttress a political agenda that's not really widely shared, that is right-wing, not conservative, but right-wing beyond, and authoritarian. And I would say this year, the best book I've read on the subject came out by a journalist named Catherine Stewart. I had the good fortune to talk with her last week about the book, um, where she identifies that this is a movement that is extremely well organized, deeply funded, that pulls together people from this is why I want to explain that it's important to get what we're up against. There are true multi-billionaires funding the movement, not all of whom would identify as Christian believers or would fit the theology of churches that you might be aligned with. There are think tanks and policy centers that do the work of coming up with the policies and strategies that drive the movement. She uses the image of metaphor of sergeants for the pastors and religious leaders who mobilize people, motivate them, get them out. Infantry for, the in the pew kind of Christians who show up at rallies, give money, show up in school board meetings and civic gatherings and all that, register people to vote. And then, there are the people who are in politics or in centers of political access who have power. And when you think about this incredible amount of money, I'll give one local example later, aligned with a whole structure of think tanks and policy centers with people trained to rally their troops out of congregations and local settings, and people holding office or other positions of influence, you have an incredibly formidable movement in a society like the United States. And last week, I spoke to a group of pastors in Western Canada and Edmonton, Alberta, who are already starting to feel the influence of this kind of movement percolating up into the environments in which they serve. So thinking about it as an organized, extremely funded, networked movement, and not just a set of ideas or attitudes, is essential to being able to provide leadership in a context where Christian nationalism is shaping things. I think another aspect that's really important to get a hold of is that even among the Christian streams of Christian nationalism, there are diverse flavors of it, and they have different kinds of access to political power. Most Americans, when they imagine Christian nationalism, are thinking about what we used to call the religious right, like the moral majority, Jerry Falwell, Billy Graham, kind of denominational figures. You see them both, conservative suit, white shirt, fairly conservative tie. I think Jerry was trying hard that day, but that kind of Christianity is what's in our imaginations. It is not what's driving politics in the United States anymore, and it is absolutely not what's driving growth among Christian groups in the United States. In fact, the fastest growing movement, at least among white people in the United States, one of the very few that's growing at all, is a network often called the New Apostolic Reformation, but of independent, that is not denominational, charismatic, and Pentecostal figures. When you think access to power, when you see pictures of Donald Trump and people praying for him, laying hands on him, most of those people are apostles and prophets affiliated with this non-denominational movement. The woman in white is Paula White Cain, who is pastor of a megachurch based in Orlando. She's also the White House faith advisor, right? So that is a lot of access. When you see this group, you're going to hear language of apostles and prophets who speak directly for God, give prophetic declarations. I've heard one apostle take credit for the death of a Democratic politician because he declared it. Um, You'll hear language of dominionism, that Christians are called to take dominion over what they would call the seven mountains of culture, which is another idea that was extremely obscure 11 or 12 years ago. It is not obscure anymore in American Christianity. You'll hear language about spiritual warfare, but they mean strategic political spiritual warfare, not an individual struggle to live, free from sin. And they'll name demons and spirits associated with particular people or institutions. That language of spiritual warfare has a way of blurring into legitimating political violence. And you'll hear the language of spiritual warfare more and more across the board in Christian nationalist circles. I won't spend too much time on this slide because I'd rather talk with you than at you. But there's strong evidence that the January 6th insurrection had a lot to do with these apostles and prophets. In the period between the November 20 election and the January 6th event, um, apostles and prophets were organizing national prayer calls, conducted through the internet. U.S. House of Representatives Speaker Mike Johnson was involved in a lot of those calls. 8 days before the insurrection, a group of a dozen or so of these apostles and prophets visited the White House for 2 hours. And a couple said, hey, we were praying and strategizing, and great things are going to happen on January 6th. On January 6th, of the 6 protest permits that were issued that day, either 3 or 4 were issued to apostles and prophets. We're talking about people who claim that they lead networks of 25,000 churches globally. I'm talking about individuals. And often, folks in a community where I live would say, where are these churches? You say they're there. Which ones are they? And I begin to name them, and they're like, oh, they're mega churches. But, not often on the radar. A second movement we're hearing about a lot now, we might call radically reformed, far on the right of reformed Presbyterian kind of Christianity. A key figure in that movement is Douglas Wilson, who's a pastor in Moscow, Idaho. He started a press, a school, a university, a network of what's called classical Christian schools, and has built a press with curriculum that supplies homeschoolers. And in other words, his church is not that big, but his reach is massive. And we're starting to see him on CNN and in other national media outlets. Doug Wilson is so extreme that he describes his politics as just to the right of Jeb Stuart, who was a Confederate cavalry commander. He's written 2 books arguing that Southern slavery in the United States was not as bad as people say, and that it was the best period for race relations in the history of the country. It's out of this movement that we're beginning to hear Christian preachers say that women should not have the right to vote. And we're hearing a lot of stories of domestic violence or other kinds of abuse within marriages, abuse toward children out of this movement, largely out of the logic that um, women are responsible for making sure that they don't present themselves as targets to sexually desiring men. You hear language like Christians must recover the virtue of hatred, or the language that empathy is a sin, which is kind of a new invention in Christian theology. But that was been around for about 10 years. Big books, people with big followings, conferences, access to power. The United States Secretary of Defense is a member of one of those churches and sends his children to one of those schools and has Christian nationalist crusader tattoos all over his upper body. When you hear this movement, listen for language about magistrates, not officials, not elected officials. This sounds like 16th century Europe. The language of theonomy, rule according to the Bible, of reconstruction, and a lot of language about authority and patriarchy. The third movement I'll discuss briefly is from the Roman Catholic stream of Christianity. We would call it integralism. It's the idea that we should go back to the period before the modern era where the state served the purposes of the church. It's not that the church would tell the state what to do, but the state should support the true religion and its virtues. The Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, has written about his conversion to Catholicism and articulates that point of view. The guy on the left of your screen, you might not recognize. His name's Leonard Leo. He's the founder of the Federalist Society that has placed the six conservative Supreme Court justices, countless federal judges. Of those six, five are Roman Catholics, and some have strong Catholic integralist associations. Leonard Leo has received awards from Opus Dei, an extreme right Roman Catholic lay and priestly order. So, what I'm naming in this is that these are very diverse streams of Christianity. The charismatics would think the other two lack the Spirit. The Reformed would think the other two are going to hell. The Catholics would say, well, they're just not part of the true church. They're out of true fellowship. But when it comes to political activity, they align lockstep. And that's what I mean by what we're up against is that for political purposes, people who have very conflicting interests are willing to invest an enormous amount of energy and money to create a particular kind of authoritarian state. If you don't mind, I'm just going to skip the next two slides. They're useful, but I like to give a local example. I live in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It's people who know Lancaster think it's a rural area. There is a lot of farming, but it's a county with a population of over 600,000. Um, Most people would call that a metropolitan area, right? Um, and we have here in Lancaster County, Lancaster Bible College, which is a very conservative Christian school. Local reporters have been doing amazing work, and they found out that this foundation that had its mailing address at the Bible College, and by the way, the head of the foundation was the son of the Bible College president. This thing called the Eden Bridge Foundation had received tens of millions of dollars from donors to pass through to various kinds of Christian causes. These could be Christian colleges, schools, missions organizations, and all that. But what they found was a significant cut of those donations go to think tanks and Christian nationalist legal centers and other kinds of political causes. Tens of millions of dollars out of this community. And the reason I use this example is it shows how the funding works. Let's say you have money, you're relatively wealthy to really wealthy, and you want to donate to a far right-wing political cause. You don't want your name stuck to it. So you send it to the Eden Bridge Foundation. Now you've donated to the Eden Bridge Foundation. It's just that you designated where the money's going to go. And then it goes out to those organizations, but you're not going to get a call from the newspaper about it. You tracking how that works? This is happening all over the country. We're lucky to have 3 democracy reporters dedicated to Central Pennsylvania through a partnership of the local newspaper and the local NPR station. And they're finding stories like this all over the place. The other place where things are really hot is public education. And I would just say that when you see any of these issues that circulate from time to time, and they tend to rotate because they're strategically managed, for example, vouchers. Should we take funds that are public funds that are dedicated to support public schools, but let Christian parents or any parents use that same money to send their kid to a private school, right? That would be just one example of the kind of issue that pops up. All of these issues, when it boils down to it, are because Christian nationalists think public education is evil and they want to put an end to it or dominate it. So it's a constant cycle of issues and crisis to the degree that it's very hard for school administrators and school boards just do their business. And all of it is meant to just keep brick by brick pulling out from the capacity to give quality public education. Um, I don't want to spend too much time on this either, and we're doing okay on time. But what sociologists and political scientists, other social scientists are finding is that when people align with those Christian nationalist survey prompts, they tend also to have um, statistically remarkable views on a host of other social issues. For example, when it comes to race, they're more likely than other Americans to think that if Black and brown people are poorer than the rest of the population, if they die younger, if they get sicker, if they have infant mortality rates, if lower education levels, lower incomes, wealth, that it's not the fault of American history or American social structures. It's the fault of Black and brown people. They're more likely to be suspicious of immigration, and we see how that's playing out politically now. They're more likely than other Americans to think women should be submissive, that the ideal role for a woman is to be a housewife, that women shouldn't be able to, maybe, not allowing women to vote is pretty extreme, but shouldn't really be in positions of public leadership, certainly not spiritual leadership. And of course, extremely harsh views of LGBTQ people that right now is manifesting itself particularly toward trans people. Less likely than other Americans to trust science and education, things like medical advice during a pandemic or science related to climate. Um, Likely to have harsh views on criminal justice. I think one of the remarkable things that we've seen is a certain percentage of Americans who don't mind when the government sends folks who are undocumented to countries where they are likely to be either tortured or enslaved. You don't see people seeming to be bothered by that. To me, it's an outrage. Over half the people who identify as Christian nationalists would say that either white people or Christians are the most disadvantaged or persecuted groups in our society. And just repeat that. White people or Christians. And they're more likely than other Americans to think democracy could be done away with or that political violence might be necessary in order to create a healthy society. About 3 to 4 times as likely as other Americans are with that one. We're beginning to hear this language. Are you a heritage American? We've heard our vice president talk about being American isn't what Ronald Reagan said it was, that you buy into the values of American democracy and freedom and all that. No, a heritage American is somebody who can trace their ancestors back at least to the Civil War. J.D. Vance has said this in multiple occasions. So sort of changing that dynamic. PRRI, I mentioned them earlier, track the kinds of things I just said, but they found that 8 in 10 Christian nationalism supporters would agree that immigrants are invading our country, replacing our cultural and ethnic background. And here's something, it's a couple of years old, but it's 2 questions put together. Again, through PRRI. Do you agree that God intended America to be a promised land for European Christians? Okay. Note that you get the Christian dominionism there, right? It's a land for Christians. And you get a nice dose of racism. European Christians is that prompt. Also, do you agree that true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country? Of the people who said yes to the European Christian question, 43% said yes to the violence question. 10% of the people who said no to the first one said yes to the second one. So you see a greater willingness to embrace political violence and a host of other issues that we would identify as far right wing in Christian nationalist circles. Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead are evangelical sociologists who have been doing wonderful work on this issue for 6 or 8 years. In their book Taking America Back for God. It's old now. It's 5 years old. That's old, but incredible data from this research. One of the things that they found is they created this scale for measuring with their survey data how strongly someone identifies as a Christian nationalist. And 24 would be like really, really extreme, and 0 would be something close to me. Um, Notice that the belief that voting is a privilege rather than a right, that you might have to earn it, you might lose it, correlates sharply with a Christian nationalist outlook to the degree that people who strongly identify with Christian nationalist outlooks are more likely than not to think voting is a privilege, which think of all the voting legislation and court cases going on here to make it harder for people to vote. That's because people think that's a good thing. Um, one more note on the what we're up against. It is not just a national movement, it's international. We're seeing gatherings and think tanks and funds and ideas traveling um, from the United States to Hungary and back. A lot of what we're seeing in Project 2025 came from Hungary. I had the opportunity to visit democracy activists in Hungary a couple of years ago. A lot of what we're seeing has been done already. Poland, Russia, until it wasn't cool to mess with Russia, Germany, France, Italy, um, Ghana, right? Um, Brazil. Oh my gosh, Brazil. So just recognizing that this is a global movement that is out to put an end to democracy and establish a certain kind of right-wing Christian value system over everyone else. What should we know as leaders that can help us respond to a movement this sophisticated, well-resourced, with such intense volunteer activity? It might help to realize that the movement is made up of people who otherwise would not get along with each other. Just recently in our area, we've had an outbreak of Ku Klux Klan propaganda being handed out by women at parades. There are the tech billionaires in Silicon Valley and elsewhere who are funding whole communities that have charters where they can live and decide their own laws so that these kinds of Christians can live there and live the way they want. There are old school business interests that just prefer not to be regulated or taxed heavily. There are populists who are just angry that their communities have declined and been neglected. And then there are these different kinds of Christians. If we can find ways to speak against some of the movements, shed light on some of them, or address the concerns of, let's say, resentful populists or business interests, there's a chance that this movement might not hold together. I will say this, if they get true ultimate power, they won't get along because then those issues will surface. So, what about from Christian leadership perspective? Um, this is where I'd like for us to be able to talk and spend our time for the rest of the night. One, I'm not the only one who says this, but this is something I have actually researched to a degree that I'm satisfied about it. When you listen to Christian dominionist preaching, you will hear almost none of the things Jesus did and said that we think of as distinctive to Jesus. You'll hear Jesus as a label, right? We worship Jesus. You'll hear Jesus died for us. You'll hear Jesus is Lord. Jesus gives us authority. You'll hear that. You will not hear blessed are the lowly. You won't hear blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice. Love your neighbor, love your enemy, love one another. You won't hear rich man and Lazarus, good Samaritan, prodigal son, persistent widow, parable of the laborers. You will not hear about Jesus' activities of traveling, feeding people, healing people, building community, looking out for human welfare, unless it's about doing miracles, where you will hear of that kind of thing. To the degree that we keep forming communities in the imagination of Jesus, we are resisting Christian nationalism. There are even reports from prominent pastors that when they've preached from like the Sermon on the Mount, they've just had folks come up to them at the end of the sermon and said, "Stop with that leftist bullshit." And that's a real thing. I think we can help form our communities to think about how Jesus relates to power. In Mark, for example, Jesus tells his disciples, don't lord it over other people like the Gentiles do. Instead, look to serve. That kind of dominion is absolutely foreign to the ministry of Jesus. And if we can think about freedom also in the perspective of Christian theology, what does freedom mean? Well, it doesn't mean the freedom to dominate other people. It doesn't mean if there's a pandemic, you don't have to observe public health guidance because you're free to choose. It doesn't mean that you can carry whatever kind of weapon you want wherever you want to go, that makes other people feel unsafe. Freedom in the gospel is freedom from sin, and it's freedom to love and serve other people. These are just things that you don't even have to say Christian nationalism or name the movement, but just stay close, right? To these sort of informing communities over time. One other thing I would add, and this is a little bit in the head, so I don't know if it's what you'd want to emphasize, but it is basically true that in countries where you have either Christian nationalist regimes like Hungary and Russia, or state-sponsored churches, guess what else you have? Nobody going to church. Like Hungary, which calls itself a Christian nation, church attendance is something like 9 or 11%, about the same in Russia. But you also have Christian churches in parts of Scandinavia, in Germany, in France and Italy and England. Nobody goes to church. We need to think about that and ask people, does having a certain kind of Christian with access to political power guarantee that things are going to be better? Because historically speaking, they don't. The founders of this country chose not to include God in the Constitution. A lot of Christians at the time protested that. But the reason they chose it was they were afraid of civil war over religion, because tens of millions, if not hundreds, of Europeans had killed each other over religion in the past 2 centuries. So we should at least be able to help people ask that question of how does Christianity really flourish? Um, I will say there'd be a lot of resistance among some people to that conversation. Finally, I'm thinking about the conversations you're likely to have, maybe with church people, maybe with neighbors, maybe with family members. Folks have these conversations at work where, let me just put it this way. When was the last time you were disagreeing with someone over something that was really important to you both? and you said something so brilliant that other person said, "Oh my God, I've been wrong my whole life." Thank you to those of you on the screen for smiling, right? It might happen. It almost never happens. And by the way, that's not how you've changed your mind about things either, right? We change our mind over time. We change our mind through relationships and experiences. Nobody's likely to just argue us out of something. In fact, and this depresses me, but social psychologists will tell you that if someone believes in like a crazy conspiracy theory and you show them the proof that that theory is wrong, they are more likely than not to become more entrenched in the conspiracy theory. So just don't argue. Just don't argue. So I do want to note as we respond that sometimes we have to be fierce. And I want to say that's not most of the time. But if someone is attacking your gay or lesbian couple friends, um, it's time to tell them to shut up and put ourselves between them and our friends. If somebody's making things hard for children, we need to be willing to just say, I'm not having it. I don't care, and be fierce. But I also want to say that's not most of the time. And while it may protect an individual, it doesn't change the person's behavior. They'll just do more of it. So, what I would encourage you to do is start by tending to your spirit. I don't know about you. I know about my wife. I know about me. I know about a lot of my friends. We're anxious. We're losing sleep. We're angry. We're bitter. We're scrolling the news at every break. Um, Whatever tend to your spirit means to you, it might mean the rituals of the church. It might mean prayer and devotion and Bible study. It might mean walks or runs or puppies or children or family. It might mean nature. I don't know. But this is going to be around a long time, regardless of what happens in elections. And we need to fill our spirits with good things. That includes, and this is where religious leaders have a special gift, build community. Like if you're in a local church pastoring, work on building relationships of community and interdependence there. Um, because everything in our culture is driving people apart. And I don't just mean the political debates, I mean the hours we work, the activities our kids are engaged in, the amount of stress that's on ordinary people just to get by. Do all you can to build resilience in your communities. If you're in one of those conversations, um, just do not argue. But I think you will learn and they have a chance to learn if you ask folks questions. So I hear that this is really important to you. Could you tell me when you started to believe that? Could you tell me why it's important to you? What's at stake in that value you have? I mean, just what, don't argue and reply. But what we find is that a lot of the time when we're in tense conversations, right, we're in fight flight mode. And the last thing we're likely to do is be reflective. But you can, by being, a human, genuinely engaged presence, open up some reflectiveness simply by, hey, tell me more. I like to brag about this, except that it sounds creepy. I promise I'm not creepy, but I do great with kids. And I think the reason is that when I'm with kids, I'll say, hey, what do you think about that? What's your opinion? And nobody ever asks them what they think about it. And when you do it, you have a friend for a minute. Um, the next thing I want to suggest, this is the last slide, I promise, is learn from evangelicals and Black and brown Christians how to testify. And by that, I don't mean necessarily what we do in church, where we tell the story about how God's been good in our lives and how sinful we were before Jesus. I don't mean that exactly. But this is homework. Please take a pad of paper and a pen or a pencil, not a tablet, not a phone, not an electronic device, paper and a writing instrument. And give yourself 10 minutes just to scribble. What are things that are dear to your heart, values you really hold dear, that you can speak to from the heart without arguing? When I do this exercise, I come up with things like, I've got a grandson. I want every kid to have access to the same kind of education he gets. I want to live in a society where I think my neighbors are people that I can build great things with, and they're not enemies. I don't want to live in a society where somebody else's pastor is doing the praying for my grandson. That, believe it or not, is a conservative argument, isn't it? But I don't. Um, I as a Christian, I believe every person's created in God's image. And I think every human, no matter what their background or whatever their features or however they live, deserves to live with dignity. Those are just values that, frankly, I was raised to hold. And I can speak them in a way that's not argumentative, but inviting, and just share. Think how radical it is in 2025 just to say, I think we could do things better together. That's a radical thing, but I believe it. Finally, and I'll stop the slideshow. Um, Organize, partner, find groups, movements. It doesn't have to be a political party. Um, we have an organization where I live called Power Interfaith that works on things like criminal justice and public education and environmental justice in poor neighborhoods. Um, but understand, we talked about this movement. We talked about how well funded it is, how well organized it is, how activated its volunteers are. And those of us who care about equity and inclusive democracy and all that think those things are volunteer activities. They are not volunteer activities if we want to live in a democracy that's pluralistic and collaborative. And so we have to find, whether it's through our denomination, through a particular interest group, yeah, okay, a political party, but we have to figure out how to organize. Because in this country, it's not how many people agree with you, it's how many people agree with you enough to do something about it.